Hello, welcome back to the Foundations of American Democracy. I am Dr. Nicole Warrington Granston, and today we're going to be looking at interest groups. So basically, we'll be explaining what interest groups are, how they influence American politics, and the different theories about whether interest groups strengthen or weaken democracy. We'll also discuss lobbying, PACs, grassroots activism, iron triangles, policy networks, and efforts to regulate lobbying. With that, the goals of today's presentation would be to define interest groups, explain how interest groups influence government, examine lobbying strategies, explore theories about interest groups and democracy, and discuss regulation of lobbying and campaign influence. Now, let's start off by defining an interest group. Now, interest groups are organizations that try to influence public policy and government decisions without directly running candidates for office. They represent the interest of businesses, workers, ideological causes, identity groups, professional associations, and geographic communities. So from this, we know that interest groups organize people with shared interest to influence government policy. Now, why do they exist? Interest groups help citizens participate in politics beyond voting. They provide information to policymakers, they represent specific viewpoints, they mobilize citizens, and they also influence legislation and public opinion. Therefore, we see that interest groups connect citizens with government. But what can we say about interest groups? Is it really an American tradition? Now, we've seen that many observers have noted that Americans have a propensity to join and form groups that is somehow deeply embedded in our American culture and largely associated with our First Amendment's freedom of association. Our forefathers even wrestled with the idea of interest groups. James Madison in Federalist Number 10 saw it developing, and that interest groups would become an inevitable part of a free society. His solution was this: to increase the number of interest groups so no one group would become too powerful, and that interests would have to work together to accomplish anything. Now, recent trends show that we've seen the number of interest groups increasing dramatically to pressure government. And as we've seen, as government power increases, more groups evolve to influence and pressure government. And we're seeing largely where a lot of underrepresented groups are using interest groups to pursue their policy goals. So what are some of the interest group strategies that are used? The number one strategy uses that of lobbying. So lobbying is a process of attempting to influence government officials and policy decisions. Who do lobbyists target? They target Congress, executive agencies, courts, and state and local governments. You find that lobbyists try to shape laws, regulations, and public policy outcomes. What we get from this is that lobbying is one of the main ways organized interest influence democracy. And we can look at lobbying from two perspectives, from that of it being conducted as an iron triangle or through policy networks. So let's look at the iron triangle. Now, with the iron triangle, the three main components of this are interest groups, congressional committees, and bureaucratic agencies. You find that these three groups cooperate closely to shape policy. The main criticism of the iron triangle is that they can make policymaking less transparent and more controlled by insiders. What we find is that iron triangle suggests that small groups of insiders can dominate policymaking. Then we have what we call issue or policy networks. And you find that policy networks have largely replaced the rigid iron triangles. Policy networks tend to be very loose, flexible relationships among interest groups, experts, bureaucrats, politicians, and media actors. The key difference with this, as opposed to the iron triangle, is that policy networks are more open, less secretive, and more inclusive than iron triangles. So what you find is that modern policymaking involves many competing voices instead of fixed alliances. Now, we've also seen in recent years the development of what we call intergovernmental and even reverse lobbying. Now, when we describe intergovernmental lobbying, this is when you'd find that government officials would lobby other government officials across different branches at the federal, state, or local levels. An example of this would be a governor lobbying Congress for federal funding. Then there's also reverse lobbying, where government officials are trying to influence interest groups to support preferred policies. What we get from this is that influence flows both towards and away from government officials. Now, the second activity of interest groups is that of grassroots activities. Now, grassroots activities, this is where you find interest groups will mobilize ordinary citizens to support their causes. Some of these strategies include public rallies, speeches, advertisements, letter writing campaigns, and protests. The goal of this is to create public pressure on policymakers. So what you find is that grassroots activism gives interest groups power to mobilize ordinary people. The next strategy that they tend to use is the court system. You find that interest groups also influence policy through the judicial system. Some of the judicial strategies used are funding litigation, filing amicus curiae briefs, which is a friend of the court briefs, and participating in judicial confirmation battles. So you find that the court is another major arena for political influences. Then we have the political action committees, or PACs. You find that PACs are fundraising organizations connected to interest groups. The purpose of PACs are to raise money, donate to political campaigns, and increase access to politicians. The main point is that PACs contribute money in legally regulated amounts to maximize political influence. Now, there's a major debate about this, where critics argue that PACs give wealthy interests too much influence in elections. Now, there is different theories in trying to answer the next question, which is, what do interest groups do for democracy? So the first theory that tries to explain the relationship between interest groups and democracy is that of pluralism. Pluralists believe that many competing groups participate in politics, that no single group would dominate, and that government policy will reflect the broad political interests of various groups. So defined in this case is that competition among groups would strengthen democracy. Next, we have what is called hyperpluralism. Now, hyperpluralist argues that too many groups create gridlock, that opposing interests block policy change, and that government becomes ineffective. Therefore, they argue that excess competition among these groups can paralyze government. Next, we have interest group liberalism. This theory argues that interest groups have become too powerful, that policy making is controlled by connections among interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy. So it kind of shows that in this explanation that iron triangles dominate policy decisions. Then we have the power elite theory. I find that power elite theorist believes that a small group of wealthy and influential people dominates government, and that corporate and upper class elites shape national policy. So you find that from this explanation, or these explanations, that different theories disagree on whether interest groups represent democracy or distort it. However, the argument has been, can interest groups be regulated? Now, because interest groups are protected by the First Amendment, we find that regulating them is politically difficult. We've had some major regulatory laws passed in America trying to address this. We have the Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act of 1946 that required disclosure of lobbying activities and financial contributions. We have the Federal Campaign Finance Laws of 1971 and 1974 that regulated campaign donations and contributed to the growth of PACs. We then had the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 that created conflict of interest rules for former government officials. And we also had the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 that required lobbyists to, one, register with the government, and two, report activities regularly. So we find that governments or the government have tried to balance free political participation with transparency and accountability. Now, a central question to consider is as follows. Which interest group do you think best represents your interests and why? This would encourage a discussion amongst yourself about identity politics, ideology, issue-based activism, and geographic interests. With that, these are some core takeaways you should take from today's presentation. One, that interest groups are essential participants in American politics, that lobbying influences all branches of government, that PACs and grassroots activism are major tools of influence, that iron triangles and policy networks shape policymaking, that different political theories disagree on whether interest groups help or harm democracy, and that regulation attempts to increase transparency without violating free speech rights. So, of course, we'll end with the fact that there's still major discussion on whether interest groups strengthen democracy by representing citizens or weaken it by increasing unequal influence. Thank you.